And during these unsettling times, we thought it's a great way to keep us together and interact. And just few housekeeping things is please mute your microphone and turn off your video during this webinar. You can use the chat box to ask any question to the speaker during the webinar, and we'll try to moderate them towards the end of the session. And firstly, I apologize if any of you have faced any technical glitches during signing in, but we assure we will just get better together with this new normal. While there are several advantages to these virtual meetings, as you can attend multiple lectures from different countries just by clicking from one tab to another using a computer. The best thing I learned about organizing these webinars is I get to hear questions from many students who would otherwise hesitate to ask questions in a normal auditorium. So this is your time to not to be shy and let all your curiosities pour in. You may ask in Bengali as well, and I'll try to translate them for the speaker. And I hope we'll have a nice session today. So with that, I request ERB to say a few words, and then we will head on with the speaker introduction. ERB, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you so much, সবাইকে স্বাগত, and thank you Nishant for being our first speaker for a series that I hope we all collectively hope will run for a long, long time. So a warm welcome to the speaker. আর এইটা আমাকে একটু বাংলাতে বলতেই হবে যে সৌনক তার অনুপ্রেরণায় আজকে এই যে প্রোগ্রেস এন্ড প্রসপেক্ট ইন বায়োলজি ওয়েবিনার সিরিজ শুরু হলো। মানে অনুপ্রেরণা, ইন্সপিরেশন, এপিফ্যানি যাই বলি কম, বুঝলি নিউ নর্মাল বললি একটা অবসাদ গ্রাস করছিল আমাদের এখানে যারা আছি around the world. Everybody has some connection to Bengal, and we know what we have been going through in the last few months. It's been a very, very trying time for all of us. তো সেখানে সবথেকে বড় কথা in these times is to keep afloat. And to keep afloat, I think enrichment of the mind, to keep the mind alert and engaged in meaningful exercise is very important. সেইখানে সৌনকের কথা এবং তোরা সবাই খুব খাটছিস, you have been working really hard. সৌনক, দুষ্যন্ত আর সঞ্জনা বোধহয় রে। So I'm very, very glad that this is happening, and we should all make this run for a long time. Progress and prospect bolte jeta amar expectation, torao sabai tar moddhe participate korbi, is networking in these times of social distancing, physical distancing, exchange of ideas, collaborate long term and short term. Amra institutionের অঙ্গ হিসেবে বলছি, we will try to facilitate if this results in collaborative grants or student exchange programs or research of any kind, exchange of ideas. But most importantly, once a week বা twice a week যদি হয়, both academic and professional expertise we will draw from the alumni of zoology department, Calcutta University and outside, and we will try to run this for as long as we can. Group quest-এর কথা বলছিলি সৌনক, আমি জানি না এখানে যারা আছিস তারা কতজন গ্রুপ quest-এ পার্টিসিপেট করেছিস, but all good ideas as we were discussing do tend to take on a life of its own, and I hope that this will also be one of them. Good work, guys. Welcome, Nishant, and without much ado, let us begin the lecture. Look forward to it.
Okay, thanks for the kind words, ERB. It is as well, like it's difficult to organize this without a team effort, and it's delightful to get the overwhelming response we got in such a short notice. So it is with special excitement that I'm pleased to introduce Nishant. Nishant as our speaker, who I know for many years now. I'm thankful to him to agree to give a talk at such a short notice. Nishant is a fellow zoologist like many of us, and he did his undergraduate from Delhi University, and then he moved to the Wildlife Institute of India in Dehradun to do a MSc in Wildlife Sciences. It is here when he got interested in working on black kites. Interestingly, Nishant belongs to a very small cohort of people who can carry forward a master's project to do his PhD and finally keeping the same research ideas to start his own research group now. He got a Felix Scholarship from Oxford to do his PhD with the renowned ornithologist Dr. Andrew Goslar at the Edward Grey Institute in Oxford. He returned back to India last year and currently holds joint appointment with Wildlife Institute in India and Oxford. He has a large group of undergraduate and master students who work with him in tagging kites and tracing their behavior. With all this cool stuff, we'll look forward to hear from him and get some recent insights he has on black kites. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Nishant.
Am I audible, Shaunak?
Yes, you are.
Great. And is the slide on projection the correct screen which I'm
Yes.
supposed to? Okay.
Yes, that's what we do.
Thanks a lot for the introduction, and thanks, Professor ERB, for the welcome. It feels great to address a set of students starting from their undergrad years and the ones who are already in their postgrads, because I think 1 decade is not a long time, and we can relate to these transitions very well. So I'll start off right away. Are people able to see the first screen?
We can see it.
Great. So I'm sure people would have read the basic description with the advertisement of the talk. And it was regarding a bird which needs no introduction, at least for the people who are residing in this part of the world. And also not for the people who are in Africa, Europe, Central Asia, northern parts of Asia, or Australia. It is said to be arguably the commonest bird in the group, which is called raptors or birds of prey. So people in our fraternity or people who are interested in wildlife or animals in general would have a straight question. Why to study a bird which is not facing a conservation concern when we have limited resources to be spent on thousands of species which are facing extinction risk? So the answer lies in what is going to follow subsequently. On the slide over here, you can see the largest landfill in Asia on the eastern border of Delhi. It's called Ghazipur landfill site, and it houses about 10,000 kites hovering over it. And the phenomena of observing these kind of flocks in Delhi is not new. If you check bird books or literature on bird ecology, people have mentioned about these birds and their flocks for about 4 to 5 decades. All the top books on raptors and birds discussing the population ecology or conservation status of birds or how birds have been responding to human changes have a mention about kites of Delhi. I think these kind of mentions somewhere in 1960s or 70s prompted one Russian researcher by name Vladimir Gulishin to study them or study raptors in general in Delhi. And of course, when we start a study, we have limited resources and we wish to touch on cursory points. So it was interesting if you read the literature which was published in 1971 issue of the journal IBIS, that black kites constituted 83% of the breeding stock of birds. So when we have a common discussion in canteens in context of how have other birds, which are probably opportunistic scavengers, have behaved in the absence of vultures, we all have seen transition of vultures from being the top scavengers in our landscapes, and currently they are reduced as to roughly 3% of their erstwhile numbers. So India is a land wherein people and animals and to be more broad, we should rather talk about the tropics as such, where people share a lot of association with animals and birds and so other different species around them. It can also be with plants. We all know about how people associate with kejari trees in the western part of India. And depending upon the local situations of how people have co-evolved or shared the living spaces with animals, plants, and different species, they form socio-ecological relationships. Quite often, these socio-ecological relationships in Southern Asia are visible in religious expression or religio-cultural expressions, wherein people tend to associate with ritual feeding. I'm pretty sure on certain days, irrespective of the religion or the cultural practices, you all associate with few rituals which are directly associated with feeding. For Jains, it might be spreading wheat flour or leaving a trail of wheat flour for ants. For many people who worship the monkey god Hanuman, it can be offering bananas to rhesus macaques. And similarly, people offer stuff or edible stuff to dogs, crows, etc. So I think in the information world, we are not very unfamiliar with the idea of how much humans have induced as anthropogenic change. And these anthropogenic changes are causing landscape or continental scale changes to the level of something which is very local. Currently, it is very interesting to present this talk in context of the lockdown nation is facing under COVID-19. So somehow the whole world, scaling from the globalized connections we used to have to the level of our local interactions, is on a pause. And these kind of situations allow us to focus or gather focus about how the changes might be happening around us. So a major part of this talk would focus on migration of kites from Central Asia to the Indian subcontinent. And before I deal with that, I need to talk about how a small research which started as my master dissertation has become into a long-term study. So sustainability is the biggest question in context of how anthropogenic pressures have been altering the situations not only for non-humans, but also for humans included. I think COVID-19 lockdown exemplifies, and lockdown exemplified it the best. And in case somebody has still opened their chat boxes, sorry, their video or audios, please keep it on mute to assist the organizers. And now we go on into the main thrust of the topic. So as soon as I started my master dissertation, people were skeptical about why one should be studying a very common raptor. People expected this bird to nest anywhere, and people expected this bird to just be a plain scavenger. And it included a lot of comments, similar comments, even from, and expectations from my supervisors as well. The name of supervisors is possibly visible to all of us. So, of course, when you see a lot of kites around you, you don't notice a lot of kite nests. And it is true for the city like Delhi as well as in Kolkata. So when you see a lot of kites around you, and when kites are ubiquitous, their nesting places are not ubiquitous. And of course, when we sample these kites for the first year, their nests, we could understand that a significant portion of their diet came from whole-bodied prey, although scavenged meat, which is visible from this graph, which exemplifies diet constituents on the x-axis and frequency in context of number of those prey items which we could sample there. As I said, people expected them to nest anywhere, and some of my supervisors said that kites, being so opportunistic, they should be nesting so well in towers and in artificial structures just to capitalize or opportunistically capitalize on food resources extended by humans. This graph, which is visible now, somehow contradicts it because less than 5% of the nests were found on artificial structures. So very clearly in the first year of the study itself, we could associate kites as large, a relatively large raptor for an urban system, and they preferred large and stable trees to place a nest. So how do you study a bird in the urban system is solved through a basic study design. The study design is aimed at understanding how individual differences in preferences and opportunity would lead to a different ecological scenario. So when you have hundreds and thousands of species around you and you're not very aware of how they're responding to a certain atmosphere or certain environmental factors, you choose gradients. So you choose gradients in order to understand their responses, and this is what we did. So what started with 8 sampling units in 2013 has now about 30 sampling units across the length and breadth of Delhi, units of 1 square kilometer, are designed to capture how kites have been responding. And of course, apart from understanding their nesting behavior, we put transmitters on selected birds to understand their movements. The first question, of course, after solving the basic idea of whether or not kites have changed in context of their breeding densities after vultures left, was to understand their breeding preferences. We understood by the first year itself that there is no significant change in the breeding density. So it was interesting to understand the individual preferences of habitat, considering that there was no good or strong layout for such kind of study to be conducted in tropical urban system. We were very exploratory to begin with. We chose about 30 variables. Who are familiar with statistics would realize that when you choose those enormous variables, you crunch them down by seeing which are the major factors which are going to impact birds. These birds tend to pick anthropogenic filth from roads, and of course, those roads are associated with garbage. These birds, as we just talked about, need very mature and large trees. So we classified one of the variables as how the trees were available to birds. A very interesting aspect of this study, which started from exploring humans, of course, considering that humans are generating this filth, they're thought to be very important predictors of where a kite would like to nest. And of course, the built-up area is sort of an index of where you would find humans. So the most interesting aspect was a philanthropic meat tossing ritual, which is somewhat practiced throughout India, but to a very large extent in the city of Delhi and Lahore. So once the chat ends, it would be interesting to understand how people in Kolkata associate with kites, and if people who follow Islamic faith offer philanthropic meat to kites. So when we did initial statistical crunching to understand the importance, we found that all these initial variables were useful for identification of breeding habitat. It is very similar to how a new undergrad who arrives at Kolkata University would like to identify a suitable area in the city to choose a PG or to choose a private accommodation. Not everybody gets a hostel accommodation to begin with. And the preferences of such student would be in context of how far does he need to travel from the university? Where exactly will he procure his food from? And is the place where he is thinking to reside at safe enough? And other aspects related with his or her academic indulgence. And of course, you need components of recreation. So analogically, kites have their ecological preferences, which we got to learn through sustained observation of kites and their nesting behavior from 2013 to 16. On the screen is just a cartoonish or a dramatic representation. So all these variables which were important for identification we're not explaining the nest productivity. We need to understand the nest productivity to explain how birds or how well a certain individual is adjusting to the urban landscape. So only a limited set of variables were explaining the nest productivity, which was arrangement of trees, and of course the philanthropic meat, which was being made available by people who follow Muslim or Islamic faith in certain pockets of older sections of Delhi. And of course, the same set of variables also explained how frequently a kite territory or a kite nesting territory was occupied over the 4 years of sampling. So we did fix a transmitter on the back of few birds, and we got to understand that these birds explore about an area which is 500 meters from the nest points. So we published a recent article which explains it in a very simple terms. So if you imagine a random kite which is willing to breed in a city system, has to decide in terms of where it will like to make a large nest. And of course, those likelihood of finding those nests would be in green patches. And it would like to capitalize on the resources which people who follow Islamic faith are going to offer. So a kite is very likely to balance these two things together. And in statistical terms, it is called a synergistic effect. It is pretty much like a common saying wherein we say, wherein your parents advise you that in order to score well in exams, you need to study well, but you also need to maintain your health at the equal good levels. So the health and the preparation or your academic input or your academic investment interacts to lead to your academic performance. Similarly, these two components of where a kite would like to nest and where it would like to eat food impact the kite behavior of where it would like to nest in a city. So those patches of greens which are available near the old Muslim establishments where people toss meat in the morning hours after offering prayer at a mosque are very vital habitat locations for kites. And these are the zones in the city which are the most favorable spots. So what was depicted diagrammatically can now be imagined from a real life capture from a trail camera which was placed on a nest. So from this maze of the city available on the background, you can imagine how a pair of kites are going to adjust and how a male kite, which largely does the provisioning for the initial 60 days of nesting out of the 90 days, has to maintain about 2 growing chicks and the female. So life is not easy even for birds in urban systems. So if you have read basic literature which links individuals and how they hierarchically form populations. So imagine the basic classes or initial classes on ecology wherein we understand the ladder of organization or biological organization, which starts from cells to organ systems, organisms, individuals, populations. So of course, when we were very easy about the idea that individual kites are going to identify sites where they can get Muslim where they have easy access to Muslim philanthropic food, we wanted to understand its population level consequences. And it was necessary contextualizing the graph on the screen now. So on the x-axis, you can see the sampling units are distributed on the increasing level of human impact. So towards the origin point, you have near natural situation, and moving on from the intermediate disturbance level because of human impacts. On the right side of the x-axis, you have high built-up range. Of course, the y-axis depicts the nest density, and it is a typical hump-shaped graph, which is associated or which is a characteristic graph of any organism which is exploiting resources from human-dominated landscapes. So we wanted to understand why specifically few sites have extremely high densities. And in order to understand that, we had to do some complex statistics, which fresh undergrads in India might not be able to follow. So it is necessary for our education system to at least associate undergrads with researchers like us or professors who are doing active research on field, so that we gain the tools or skills of how to conduct basic statistical analysis even when we are undergrads. So I must admit that as an undergrad in Delhi University, we had no module on statistical analysis, and somehow it impacted us very severely in our master's program. And in bits and pieces, the initial lack of having a strong training in statistics still impacts our ability to conduct sound research. So for those people, I have some kind of simplified how a researcher in field tries to work. So when we are on field, so field researchers or common people, we make observations. Everybody makes observation. Researchers are one step ahead, and they form very logical explanations in context of whatever they are observing. So if a dog is very aggressive, or if you see a particular animal fleeing away from you, or in that context, how opportunistically many birds, for that sake, pigeon, for instance, are found on those sections of the city where people commonly put food. So we associate these observations into logical explanations for those observations, and they're called hypotheses. But researchers don't simply stop there. They have to move ahead and collect data in which is coherent to the logical explanation we wish to put forward. And we have statistical tests or scientific analysis, which somehow test the validity of the data collected and the logical way through which we wish to process it. So for those people who are not able to understand it, you should try and relate it with a random tailor who must have stitched the piece of ready-made cloth you're wearing. So that tailor who has stitched the shirt or a t-shirt for you uses wooden models to imagine a rough size of where how a lady or a male of a certain age or a certain body girth, which we depict by XL, XXL, or 40 size 42, or similar sizes. And then these wooden models help the trailer to come up with a dress which by and large fits us. Similarly, researchers are not very sure in the beginning, and we make a lot of guesses. On those guesses are confirmed by mathematical models. Down the line, when you if when you collaborate with your professors now, or when you are in your master's or doctoral studies, you would understand the nuances of statistical tests. So the hallmark of how one should be utilizing these tests is to understand the ecological relevance of the data, or ecological relevance of how the models or mathematical models are informing you about kite's ecology. So in this case, we built a synthetic component which somehow combined the distance at which a meat tossing site was located from a sampling site, because now we were interested in how populations are being impacted by rituals. So if this is a site, and if this is the fashion in which these meat tossing locations are distributed, we wanted to design this specific statistical component with a negative effect of how distant this colony is, and a positive effect of number of people, like this old man who are supposedly going to toss meat to kites. So this graph, I'm sorry for those people who are not following it well, tries to depict the summary of how inextricably, or you cannot extract the relationship of kites without talking, kites in Delhi for that sake, without talking how well this ritual practice of meat tossing is prevalent in the city systems. So in order to understand that, on x-axis, we have depicted increasing access to ritual subsidies. So those plots or those study systems out of the 30 units which we sampled from 2016 to 2019, they are arranged from origin towards increasing x-axis. And we plotted the population density, which was the outcome of the interaction of how food and nesting substrates interact. So if you recall the diagrammatic depiction of how kites were responding to the site availability where they can make a nest and where they can procure the food, these two components are shown to interact through these two lines which intersect each other. The hollowed circles here depict the areas with low nest availability, and the dark circles here depict the areas with high nest availability. So you would understand that there is a synergistic relationship in the population density in those areas where you have high nest availability and the areas where you have higher access to ritual subsidies. So I would discuss this in detail in context of any questions which arise. An interesting aspect which we came across was the aggressive attacks from kites, and we wanted to explain that. And I will very quickly cover this component wherein the defense score in context of how aggressive the kites were towards the research team was divided into three categorical variables. So if we assigned score ones to those nets where kites did not trouble us, the score of 2 was assigned to those kites which were alarming and circling profusely around the climber, and the score of 3 was given when they used to alarm and attack both the people who were checking or inspecting the nest and the onlookers from the team. And of course, as expected, the result of this study in context of how costly it is for kites to defend was associated with the nest content. So if a nest had higher number of eggs, and if a nest had chicks which had more promise of leading to a successful offspring, those nests were associated with higher defense. And we also tried to understand the relationship of aggression in kites with their success. And we could find out that those kites which used very aggressive modes against humans, which have been potential predators to everyone, were associated with higher nesting success. So idea is that because the action to defend against a potential intruder, which can be human, which can also be a crow, a mob, a murder of crow, and a troop of monkeys, which are potential predators. So in such situations, aggressive strategy ensures higher success, and that is why these strategies survive in the population. So I would quickly focus on to another interesting aspect of the study, which started with a basic observation of how these kites move from the landfills. So initially, we did not know that the kites which are foraging in huge numbers or in the numbers in the tune of 10,000 would actually be associated with Central Asia. On the screen, you can see a page from the book by Professor Ian Newton, and he has put a big question mark on how Central Asian landscapes and Southern Indian, South Asian and Southeast Asian systems are connected in context of bird movements. So this signifies a lot of promise for students in this part of the world. And on our screen, we now have records of black-eared kites. So over time, we got to know that a large section of the population on the landfills, which you get to see in Kolkata or Delhi, are associated with Central Asian landscapes. So they are visitors in our landscapes, and a keen bird watcher would be able to identify the differences. And we must admit that the black kite research team were not very sure about these birds till the end of 2015. So subsequently, if you go out next time, it should not be a shame. And over the time, when you get to observe them keenly, you'll understand the differences. So eBird is a site with which a lot of people from Kolkata would be familiar. And this showcases that in the summer months, these birds, black-eared kites, have been reported from their breeding regions. But if you check the breeding data, the data from eBird for the months of winter, which is about this from December to February, they all move down towards the equator, and a large population winters down in Indian subcontinent. So the transmitters on these birds from 2014 to 2018, 19 of them informed us precisely about the pre-breeding movements, which have been depicted in blue, and post-breeding movements, which have been depicted in red. The zones of wintering, which is very small in India, can be compared with the zone of their breeding ranges. I must mention that these birds, which have been tagged, most of them as the juveniles, and they're exploring a large area in their native ranges. And this yellow region was 85 times larger than the wintering region. So a question which arises into the mind of a basic student who has a training on ecology and animal behavior would be in context of innate and learned behaviors of urban foraging and distribution from their wintering to the breeding season effects of how humans have changed these systems. I have just superimposed hypothetically the Silk Route, which flanks the area divided by Taklamakan Desert in China. So the birds which were moving out from India somehow congregated in the valley of Hotan River, and once they were coming back, they were congregated in the city of Urumqi. These are the cities which have been situated on the Silk Route for over 5,000 years. So bird migration is a phenomena which must have happened even before human beings started to take control of Earth. So the oldest Homo sapiens sapiens fossil is associated with some physicists. The oldest records are somewhere placed around 320,000 years. Migration of birds is a million-year-old phenomena. So it is interesting for students of ecology, zoology to understand the drivers of migration for this part of the world. This slide depicts the focal area, and you can appreciate how their association with landfills in Delhi has allowed these birds to follow back from the points they were released. So the birds which you get to see on Kolkata, or the birds which are there in the city of Mumbai, or the birds which people see on the landfills in Ahmedabad. So all these black-eared kites are expected to showcase similar learned behavior to identify city systems where they have habituated themselves. This is a Google Earth representation of the similar black and white images. And on the right side of this image is the connection in context of a bird which was recovered in the state of Manipur in India. So this bird was wearing a tarsal band from this country of Mongolia. So I will explain it slightly later. And here on this slide, we have the summary of breeding and wintering migratory journeys. So pretty soon this research paper would be out for you to appreciate. And for people who are familiar with statistics, it is interesting to note that the major difference in the movement of these birds when they were moving northwards as opposed to when they were moving southwards was visible in context of speed of their movement. So it is ideally said that when birds are moving back to their breeding ranges, they have to claim the best of the territories, and that sort of explains the higher speeds when they're moving back. And this is, of course, associated with wind speed and a larger body mass. So these are the dynamics which we are going to explore down the line, which is urban metabolism associated with field-based foraging of kites on landfill, and how best experienced kites versus non-experienced kites associate with wind patterns. So somehow it relates very well with what we are sadly following through the news. A lot of people from the urban systems are migrating back to their native systems, much as kites. And as we understand the tough aspect of the journeys of these migrant workers, black kites have to stop over at multiple locations every night to refuel and get ahead. So the migration ecology is complex, and probably I can address that aspect in questions as well. And the interesting aspect which I was discussing in context of kite migration, and which is important for the students who are in Kolkata or eastern part of India, is this flank of migration or migratory route entry into India. So